Hi guys, so for my ice, I'm gonna be making a medieval short sword. So first what I'm doing is I'm starting to draw out the tip. I cut the piece of steel off at an angle so that I can make forging the tip easier and I won't have as much risk of getting what's called fish lips or delaminations. So here I'm making marks on my anvil with a pencil so I can get an idea of how long the blade is easier and therefore calculate where I should make the tang and stuff like that. Notice that throughout the entire process I'm constantly thinning out the blade until after grinding and polishing at the very end is a thickness of 5/32 of an inch. Here you'll see that I'm refining the tip and beginning to forge the bevels. Here you can see how hot it gets in my forge. It can often get to over 2,200 degrees. So now I'm just forging the bevels further down the blade. To isolate or start forging the tang, what I'm doing is I hang the blade end of the piece of steel off the edge of the anvil and hit where the tang is gonna be, and if I keep doing that and flipping it over, it will eventually lead to the tang being in the center. Now I'm just forging down the rest of the tang until it's at the proper thickness, length, and width. Now I'm thinning out the tang until it is thinner than the rest of the blade. This will make it easier during grinding, and it'll help the guard fit up better. You may notice that I pour water on the handle end of the piece regularly to cool it off and make it easier to hold so I don't burn my hands. Now I'm just refining the bevels. A lot of times when you forge the bevels, the blade will develop twists, and you can fix that either by putting it in a vise and twisting it manually, or by doing work on the bevels you can force the twists to come out. It's hard to explain, but it's just something you learn over time. Here I'm just doing the final touch-ups, making sure there's very little work left to be done before I go on to grinding. Remember, if you have any questions about like what I'm saying or something I'm doing, feel free to sing out. It'll probably come in handy later. So everything was going pretty well until this happened. So basically what happened is that the control panel for my 2x72 belt grinder blew, and I didn't get a replacement till much later in this project. In the meantime, I'll be working on my dad's 4x36 belt sander. What I'm doing here is I'm using a 4.5-inch angle grinder to blow off all the scale and make it easier on belts during the grinding. Here I'm roughing in the bevels on my dad's 4x36 belt grinder. I'm not going to be leaving any flats on this blade, so all you're going to see is the bevels. So I'm not focusing on cleaning off the flats at all at this. Finally, after over a month of grinding, I finally get my 2x72 belt grinder up and running again. A technique I used a lot in this project is I used the 8-inch wheel on my belt grinder to grind the bevels instead of using the flat platen. I did this because the wheel helps me be more conservative with my belts, helps me be a lot more gentle, and makes it harder to make mistakes. Here I'm moving to the flat platen on my grinder. The reason I'm doing this is because it's got smaller wheels which I can use to better grind my fullers. A fuller is basically a groove that runs down the center of the blade. Its main purpose was to reduce weight while not decreasing the structural integrity very much. After grinding a lot of the fullers on the grinder, I moved to files to try and get the rest of the way there. It was not successful. grinder it is. Now I'm moving to the final finish grinding I do before heat treat. This just makes the final stages of finishing after heat treat much easier. It seems like the footage of the actual forging of the guard has been corrupted during transfer. So here's just what I ended up with after I finished forging the guard and how I'm grinding it. I forged the guard out of a railroad spike, and I tapered the two sides, the two ends, so that I had two lobes and a center lobe. Then I just bent it and squared it, and now I'm grinding it. I coated the guard in red layout fluid so that I'd be able to scribe and mark out lines on it, and I'd be able to see them easier. This is just an automatic center punch that I'm using to mark out the holes. Now I'm moving to a larger handheld center punch to punch out the normal holes. I'm using a 1/8 inch titanium drill bit to cut through the steel and make the holes for the sun. In order to get the tang to fit through the guard, I need to connect the holes into one single slot. Here I'm doing that with a file. In order to fit the guard to the tang perfectly, I need to heat up the guard in the forge and drive the tang of the sword onto it until it fits up nice and snug and has a perfect fit. I'm keeping this part in here to show you that mistakes do happen and you always need to be careful while working with hot metal. Once the guard has been fit, I need to reheat the guard again and reshape it since the shape has gotten distorted while I've been fitting the guard on. To heat treat the blade, I first heat the blade up to a point where a magnet doesn't stick to it, around 1500 degrees. Then I dunk it in oil. In this case I'm using canola oil, and that'll flash harden the blade. And you know it works if, after you harden it, a file no longer bites into the blade. After I quench it, the blade at that point is too hard to be used. It would shatter like glass. So I heat it up again, but this time to around 500 degrees Fahrenheit. That'll give it more of a springy effect and much more suitable for a blade. Moving on to the pommel. I'm forging it from a large piece of rebar taken from the Tacoma Dome. I'm upsetting the bar, which basically means to push the bar in on itself to make it larger. After that, I move on to the horn of the anvil, where I give the pommel its rough shape. Here I move to the 8-inch wheel on my belt grinder to roughen the shape of the pommel. Here I'm going to the flat platen because it has smaller wheels. I can use them to get the final shape of the pommel. Well, now I'm drilling the hole for the tank to go in. I drill it with a 5/32 and then I go to a 1/4 later. On the 8-inch wheel, I do the final grind on the bevels. I'm starting on a 220 grit belt here, and they go all the way to 1000 grit. Remember, if you have any questions, feel free to sing out. I'll answer them for you. After that, I do the same thing to the fuller. Some final touch-ups on the 1000 grit belt. Spent a couple hours hand sanding on this blade. I went from an original starting grit of 400 all the way up to a final polish of 800 grit. For the handle, I used a piece of maple I had lying around in the shop and cut it in half with my dad's bandsaw. Then I smoothed out the surfaces on the belt grinder. Here I'm chiseling out a slot in the shape of the tang so that it'll fit in perfectly. This was how medieval swords were put together, and this is how I'm doing it now. Now I'm just gluing the surfaces with wood glue and gonna clamp them together with some normal bar clamps. After a few hours I unclamp the handle and start to fit it to the guard and the tang. This is mostly done with wood files and rasps. Once the handle is well fit to the guard, I then cut out the rough shape on the bandsaw. Here I'm attaching a small steel rod to go into the pommel and hold everything together. Now I'm doing the final shape of the handle and pommel on the grinder to make everything fit up together nice and smoothly. Now I just polish the pommel on the grinder. Here what I'm doing is I'm using a little copper rod and sticking it into the tang, and I put it above on the slack belt and it spins and polishes it really well. Now I'm just doing some light sanding with some 220 grit sandpaper before I wrap the handle in leather. Here I'm bluing the pommel with some gun bluing paste. This makes the pommel look more oxidized and more used. I personally like the look of it. Now, here's where I started to wrap the handle in leather, but my camera turned off while doing most of it. Forgot to film the actual glue up, so let's pretend this is a dramatic scene where all the pieces come together in one glorious moment. In reality, I was just making the handle snug up well with the tang. Just imagine that the pommel and guard are all there also. And here's the finished product. I definitely would have liked to do more with this. The folders are a little bit off, but all in all, I really like how it came out. It's light, it's comfortable, and it's sharp.